There is a hill in Korea that still carries the weight of one of the most extraordinary stands in modern military history. It is called Yultong, and on the night of April 22, 1951, 900 Filipino soldiers looked out across that frozen terrain and saw something that would have made most units fold on the spot. A wall of humanity was moving toward them. Tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers, organized, armed, and surging forward in relentless waves, had been unleashed as part of the largest communist offensive of the entire Korean War. The Filipino soldiers had no reinforcements coming, no clear communication with their command, and no realistic way out. What they chose to do next became the kind of story that nations build their identity around. To understand why those 900 men were standing on that hill at all, you have to go back to a country still pulling itself out of the rubble of the Second World War. The Philippines had endured one of the most brutal occupations in the Pacific, losing hundreds of thousands of lives to Japanese forces between 1941 and 1945. By 1950, the country was still broke, still healing, and still building its armed forces from the ground up. When North Korea invaded South Korea on June 25, 1950, backed by Soviet weapons and Chinese support, the United Nations called on its member states to respond. Most wealthy nations with standing armies were expected to answer. The Philippines, still nursing its wounds, was not. President Elpidio Quirino made the decision anyway. He stood before the Philippine Congress and pushed through Republic Act 573, which authorized the deployment of Filipino troops to the Korean Peninsula under what would become the Philippine Expeditionary Force to Korea, or PEFTOK. He knew the country could barely afford it. He said so plainly. In his address to the soldiers before they departed, he told them that poor as the country was, every peso invested in them was a sound investment for the preservation of liberty and freedom. It was not the speech of a man trying to inspire through comfortable lies. It was the kind of honest acknowledgement that soldiers remember when the moments get hard. The first Filipino unit to arrive in Korea was the 10th Battalion Combat Team, which docked in Busan in September 1950. It was composed of 64 officers and over 1,300 enlisted men, and it was the only Filipino mechanized armor unit in the theater. The plan had been to equip them with M4 Sherman medium tanks, the workhorse of Allied armor. Those never arrived. Instead, the 10th BCT received only a handful of the lighter M24 Chaffee tanks and was reorganized into a heavy weapons unit. On paper, that looked like a downgrade. In the hills of Korea, it would prove to be a different kind of fighting force entirely, one that relied on discipline, improvisation, and a willingness to fight at close quarters that the Chinese commanders had not accounted for. Before Yultong, the 10th BCT had already written its name into history at a place called Myeongdong. That engagement in November 1950 became the first battle ever won by Filipino soldiers on foreign soil, and it was anchored by the actions of a single man who refused to stay inside his tank while his unit was pinned down. First Sergeant Maximo Young climbed out of the hatch of his tank under active fire, grabbed the mounted machine gun on the turret, and opened up on the advancing enemy until they fell back. The engagement was small in scale, but enormous in meaning. It told the rest of the battalion something important about what kind of soldiers they were, and it gave them a foundation of confidence to carry into the battles that were still to come. By the spring of 1951, the Korean War had shifted dramatically. The initial North Korean push had been stopped. General MacArthur had executed his daring Incheon landing, and UN forces had pushed deep into North Korean territory. Then China entered the war in force, and everything changed. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army poured across the Yalu River by the hundreds of thousands, pushing UN forces back in one of the most dramatic reversals in modern combat history. By April of that year, the Chinese High Command had designed what they called the Spring Offensive, a massive coordinated assault intended to shatter the UN line, recapture Seoul, and fundamentally change the momentum of the entire conflict. The 10th BCT was directly in its path. The Chinese battle plan targeting the Yultong sector was precise and layered. The PVA's 12th and 15th Armies, along with elements of the 60th Army, were assigned to break through the area held by the Filipino unit and the attached Turkish brigade to their east. The strategy relied on sheer mass, attacking in waves at night, overwhelming defensive positions through relentless pressure before the enemy could regroup or call for support. The Chinese command had done this before, and it had worked. Against the Filipino positions on April 22nd, they had assembled what accounts describe as somewhere between 15,000 and 40,000 soldiers, depending on the source. Either figure, placed against 900, makes the situation feel almost impossible to describe in rational military terms. Artillery hit first. At 8 in the evening on April 22nd, the shelling began, slamming into the Turkish brigade positions to the east and then rolling toward the Filipino line. By midnight, mortar fire and machine gun rounds were raking across the entire 3rd Division sector. The Chinese hit the 10th BCT from multiple directions simultaneously, cutting through communication lines and separating the frontline companies from each other. Able Company lost its commander, Lieutenant Thomas Batillo, in the early fighting. Baker Company, led by Lieutenant Jose Arteaga Jr., was holding the strategic high ground of Yultong Hill when the Chinese began overrunning their position. The left platoon was pushed back first. Then the rest followed, retreating through 4 hours of close combat that cost Baker Company enormous casualties before they were pushed all the way back to Charlie Company's reserve position. What happened next in the battalion was unlike anything in the standard manual for military operations. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Dionisio Ojeda, received orders to withdraw. Every company in the 10th BCT acknowledged the order and began to pull back. Every company except one. Captain Conrado Yap, commanding the Heavy Weapons Company and the battalion's remaining Chaffee tanks, looked at the situation on Yultong Hill and made a different calculation. His men were still out there. Some were dead. Some were wounded. The Chinese were between them and the rest of the battalion. Yap did not retreat. He ordered a counterattack. The counterattack Yap led was reckless by conventional military standards and completely in keeping with the character of the soldier conducting it. He moved his tanks toward the Chinese-held hill, main guns firing as fast as the crews could load. Yap himself stood in the commander's hatch, exposed to incoming fire, operating the tank-mounted machine gun while directing the advance. The Chinese had not expected anyone to come back up that hill. The audacity of the move caught them off guard, and Yap's company punched through to Yultong Hill, reaching the survivors of Baker Company and pulling them back to friendly lines. It was a rescue operation conducted at the point of a tank gun in the middle of an active battle against a force that outnumbered the rescuers by a factor that should have made the mission suicidal. Lieutenant Arteaga did not make it out. He was killed during the fighting retreat from Yultong Hill, and he was posthumously awarded the Philippine Distinguished Conduct Star, one of the highest honors the country can give to a soldier who gave everything. Yap's story ended at almost the same moment as the victory he had earned. After directing the withdrawal from the hill, conducting a head count of his men to ensure no one was left behind, Yap was struck by machine gun fire. He died on the hill he had just recaptured. His death was the kind of ending that seems written to underscore a point history wants to make about certain kinds of people. The 10th BCT held its line through the night and into the following day. What made that stand even more remarkable was what it required of the entire battalion. When the Chinese attack first separated the companies and cut communications, every available soldier in the unit was pressed into the line. Drivers picked up rifles. Typists loaded machine guns. Clerks occupied fighting positions alongside infantry veterans. Cooks and medics joined the combat as the perimeter shrank. Even the battalion chaplain took up arms, which says something about the nature of what the unit was facing and what kind of resolve it took to face it. The 10th BCT was not fighting as a specialized military machine at that point. It was fighting as a community of men who had decided collectively that they were not going anywhere. The Filipino stand at Yultong did something the Chinese commanders had not planned for. By refusing to collapse, the 10th BCT bought the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division enough time to conduct an organized withdrawal to Line, Kansas, south of the Hantan River. If the Filipinos had broken and fled, the Chinese breakthrough would have been complete. The 3rd Division would have been exposed on its flank, and the consequences for the entire UN line in that sector could have been catastrophic. The 900 men of the 10th BCT were not just fighting for their own survival. They were functioning as a hinge on which a much larger structure depended, and they held it. When the fighting was over, the tally was stark on both sides. The 10th BCT suffered roughly a dozen killed, nearly 40 wounded, and several missing in action, though some accounts place the total Filipino losses in the battle significantly higher. Chinese casualties on the Yultong field were reported at more than 500 killed, with 2 taken prisoner. The ratio of losses tells its own story about what the Filipino unit had accomplished. The Chinese had attacked with overwhelming numbers and had been stopped, bled, and forced to pull back from their objective by a force they had every statistical reason to believe they could brush aside. The awards that followed reflected just how significant the world recognized the sacrifice to be. Captain Conrado Yap was posthumously decorated by 3 separate nations. The Philippines gave him its highest military honor, the Medal of Valor. The United States gave him the Distinguished Service Cross. South Korea awarded him the Taeguk Order of Military Merit. He remains the only Filipino soldier in history to have been given the most prestigious combat medal by 3 countries simultaneously. First Sergeant Maximo Young, who had already distinguished himself at Myeongdong, received the same South Korean Taeguk Medal decades later, when the full weight of what he and his unit had done was finally given the formal recognition it deserved. The story of Yultong carries layers that extend beyond the battle itself. Among the PEFTOK soldiers who rotated through Korea in the years that followed was a young lieutenant named Fidel Ramos, who would go on to become the 12th president of the Philippines. Ramos served in the 20th Battalion Combat Team and was present at commemorations of the Battle of Yultong, where he spoke publicly about Yap's leadership and sacrifice. The idea that a battle in the Korean hills helped shape the character of a future Philippine president is not a minor footnote. It illustrates how deeply that conflict wound itself into the fabric of what the Filipino military tradition means to the people who carry it. General Douglas MacArthur, who had commanded Filipino and American forces together in the Pacific during World War II, had famously said that if he had 10,000 Filipinos, he could conquer the world. The context of that quote was the performance of Filipino soldiers under impossible conditions during the defense of Bataan in 1942. What the 10th BCT did at Yultong in 1951 was essentially the same argument, made again on different ground, against a different enemy, with the same result. 900 men, not 10,000, holding against a force that had no rational reason to be stopped by them. MacArthur's quote was rhetorical when he said it. The hills of Korea kept proving it was something closer to fact. The Philippines sent a total of 7,420 soldiers to Korea across 5 rotations over the course of the war. Of those, 116 were killed in action, 299 were wounded, and 57 went missing. The last Filipino troops left Korea on May 13, 1955. In a conflict that is sometimes called the Forgotten War, because it falls between the massive global attention given to the Second World War and the cultural explosion surrounding Vietnam. The Filipino contribution is doubly overlooked. Most people who have heard of the Korean War have never heard of Yultong. Most people who have heard of Yultong have no idea that the unit holding that position was not American, not British, not one of the major powers, but 900 volunteers from a country that had barely survived its last war and chose to fight someone else's anyway. There is a memorial in Yultong, South Korea, dedicated specifically to the Filipino soldiers who fought and died in that sector. South Korea and the Philippines have maintained strong military ties in the decades since the war, and the Battle of Yultong is cited regularly as the foundation of that relationship. The bond was not built in diplomatic offices or through trade agreements. It was built on a hill in the spring of 1951 by soldiers who had no reason to stay and chose to stay anyway. The South Korean government has not forgotten that. Annual commemorations, exchanges between the two nations' armed forces, and ongoing cooperation in regional security all trace their emotional roots back to those 2 days of fighting in April 1951. What happened at Yultong is the kind of story that resists easy summary, because the facts themselves are already extraordinary without embellishment. 900 Filipino soldiers, deployed by a nation still recovering from the devastation of one world war, stood against a force that outnumbered them by ratios that should have made survival impossible. They held. They bled. They lost men who had every right to be remembered by name. And when the battle was over, the hill was still theirs, and the division behind them had made it out. History is full of last stands that ended in defeat, with just enough survivors to carry the story home. Yultong was not a last stand. It was a line that held, and the men who held it carried 900 rifles, spoke Filipino, and refused, in every sense of the word, to die.